This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my intuitive eating online course. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beefing. Now I'm ready for the world, trying to sink my teeth in, stacking it.
Hey there, welcome to episode 160 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Elizabeth Scott, a weight-inclusive psychotherapist and co-founder of The Body Positive, an organization dedicated to the prevention of weight stigma and eating disorders. We talked about the problems with concern trolling and healthism and what those even mean, why it's helpful to be vulnerable when defending the health at every size paradigm, the process of unlearning diet culture and oppression, and so much more. It's a really good episode. I can't wait to share it with you in just a minute. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Kathy, who writes, I'm new to intuitive eating and body positivity, so I'm struggling with how to be healthy and not be so focused on what I eat and if I'm moving enough. I'm a nurse practitioner, and most of my life I've been told that being overweight is not healthy, and changing that paradigm has been difficult for me. How do I listen to my body and still be healthy? I feel like I'm surrounded by different opinions and people who promote weight loss. I'm tired of the diet mentality and want to help with what to do now. So thanks, Kathy, for that great question and for being interested in supporting the non-diet approach. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't intended as a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing I'll say is that being in a larger body may be associated with certain undesirable health outcomes. We do see that in the research, but correlation does not equal causation. So as a nurse practitioner or any other health professionals listening out there, you know this from your statistics classes, you know this from school and training, but really anyone who's taken a basic statistics course has heard this. This is sort of the cardinal rule in statistics that you can't infer causation just because two things are associated with one another. So yes, higher weight is associated with certain health outcomes, but we can't say that weight causes those health outcomes in and of itself. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence, which we'll get to in a moment, showing that something else is actually the causal link between weight and health outcomes. So it's not the weight causing the health outcomes, it's something else that's the intervening factor that may contribute to those or may explain entirely those negative health outcomes we see in people in larger bodies. By the way, I use that phrase, people in larger bodies, instead of the word overweight here because the word overweight is a stigmatizing term. Really, if you think about the etymology of the word, it's like over what weight, right? Over a weight that is supposedly determined to be the correct weight. Well, that's not actually true. There isn't actually a supposedly correct weight or range of weights one is supposed to be. And above that weight, they're automatically wrong, which is what the word overweight implies. And also the word obese, by the way, is a stigmatizing term, even though those are the words used in journal articles talking about weight science and stuff. So I usually give a trigger warning for anyone who's sensitive to those stigmatizing words, not to delve into scientific journal articles because there's going to be use of those words without quotation marks around them, without sort of deconstructing them like I just did here. And there's also going to be body mass index numbers and weight numbers thrown around and stuff like that. Anyway, so getting back to the point about correlation not equaling causation, in fact, weight stigma has been shown to be more of a risk factor for health than weight itself. Research has actually shown that health initiatives telling people to lose weight are stigmatizing, as are initiatives that try to get people to change their eating, quote unquote, for their health, like to eat healthier. These initiatives create a sense of moral superiority in the people who perceive themselves as following the recommendations, and they increase discriminatory treatment and exclusion of people who are perceived as not following them. And for more on the evidence about that, you can check out this really interesting paper that just came out that's called Moralized Health-Related Persuasion Undermines Social Cohesion. I'm going to give a lot of references to papers here since the person who asked the question is a health professional, and probably a lot of people listening or be interested in the science as well. But again, that sort of blanket trigger warning for research and science about health and weight, because there is some potentially problematic language in most scientific studies. And so, in fact, weight stigma can actually explain most or all of the excess disease risk seen in people in larger bodies. And another great paper to look at for more on that is a paper called Weight Science, Evaluating the Evidence for a Paradigm Shift, which is a really good start. And actually, two of my past Food Psych guests wrote that paper. It's Linda Bacon and Lucy Affermore, who are both on the show and did amazing episodes. And then you can also do a PubMed search for weight stigma, the search term weight stigma, also the search terms weight bias would be good. And that can help you just delve deeper into the research on weight stigma and why it's such a health risk factor. So weight stigma is even more of a risk factor than what people eat. In fact, according to a 2017 study called Perceived Weight Discrimination and 10-Year Risk of Allostatic Load Among U.S. Adults. So that is really interesting because public health initiatives to get people to change how they eat are almost always, like 99% of the ones I've seen, are tied to rhetoric about the so-called obesity epidemic. And I say so-called in quotes because it's a super stigmatizing term. And these initiatives are really stigmatizing people for their size, which actually harms their health more than how they eat. So even if these measures were successful, they'd still have a net negative impact on people's health because weight stigma negates any nutritional benefit people could get from those initiatives. So I think that's really important to know for all health professionals and for anyone listening out there who's getting pushback or concern trolling from the people in your life saying, well, what about what you eat? You're going to die because you're letting yourself eat what you want because you're eating X, Y, and Z food that I've demonized or that diet culture has demonized, really. And so to push back on that, even if you don't necessarily argue with the person in the moment, because it's not always feasible or desirable to do that, but just in your own mind, if you can know that research has actually shown that weight stigma has a greater risk for people's health, it's a greater risk factor for negative health outcomes than how people eat. And by stigmatizing you for what you eat, people are actually increasing weight stigma, perceived weight stigma among people because, of course, within diet culture, why are we telling people what to eat? Why is any public health initiative caring about what people eat? Well, we say it's about health, but actually underlying that supposed concern about health is always a concern about weight. That's just the reality of living in diet culture, that these health rationales for what people eat are very tied up in the rhetoric around the so-called obesity epidemic. So as a nurse practitioner, you can absolutely help people's health and well-being by helping them recover from weight stigma, by helping them question all this rhetoric about the so-called obesity epidemic that they've heard, and pushing back on that and really helping people get in touch with their bodies and their needs and learn about ways that they can take care of their health that have nothing to do with their size or with demonizing what they eat. In terms of your question about how you can listen to your body and still be healthy, it's important to take the long view here because I think sometimes people get really stuck in short-term thinking, especially in diet culture, which teaches us that the short-term benefit is the thing to strive for, and whatever happens in the long term is your fault, right? That's what diet culture teaches us. It's actually not true. What happens in the long term with diets, short-term diets may quote-unquote work. People may quote-unquote lose weight, or they may be able to stick to whatever restrictive diet they're doing in the name of health. And I'm not talking about medically diagnosed necessary diets here, like gluten-free for celiac disease or something like that has a really strong actual scientific basis. I'm talking more about the elimination diets for nebulous symptoms like bloating and brain fog and things that don't actually have a scientific basis. When people do something like that, they can maybe stick to that for a little while, right? But then they end up quote-unquote falling off the wagon and binging on the foods that were forbidden and beating themselves up and feeling like failures. And really, the thing is, the game is rigged from the start. You are not the failure. The diet is the failure. Whether it's an elimination diet, whether it's paleo, whether it's any of these diets that disguise themselves as quote-unquote wellness but are actually diets, or whether it's like a traditional diet in the sense of cutting calories or whatever, any of those things are rigged from the start not to work long-term because your body is not able to sustain that kind of restriction long-term. And so you're going to end up, quote unquote, falling off the wagon. And that's just a natural part of the diet trajectory. So it's really a diet culture move to only focus on the short term and to sort of label anything that happens in the long term as your fault or as a person's fault, when it's not. It's not actually your fault. It's the diet's fault. And so we really have to take the long view here in terms of listening to your body and being healthy, because in the long run, relearning how to be an intuitive eater, and I say relearning because we were all born with this skill, is going to be better for your health than continuing to stay stuck in the diet mentality and continuing to stay stuck in that cycle of short-term quote unquote benefit and then long-term misery. And if you want to look at some science on that, on why intuitive eating is better in the long term than dieting, you can check out the paper by Tracy Tilka called "Is Intuitive Eating the Same as Flexible Dietary Control?" There are links to each other, and well-being could provide an answer. But in the short term, while you're relearning intuitive eating, it can definitely feel like a bumpy ride because you'll be letting go of decades worth of diet culture rules. And that often means a period where you swing over into what I call the honeymoon phase, or what Jess Baker and Deb Brigard called donut land. It's a phase where you're going to go to town on all the foods that were once off limits, and you're going to really want them and want to prove to yourself that you have permission to eat them. And this phase lasts as long as it needs to last until you learn that you truly have unconditional permission to eat all foods, and practicing the other principles of intuitive eating and recovering from diet culture as well. All of that together eventually helps you start to crave more variety. So you won't magically stop craving the foods that you've deemed off limits, the fun foods, the exciting foods, nor should you, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. But eventually you will not want them every single second of the day, like some people experience in this honeymoon phase. And people in the honeymoon phase often get concerned because they're flouting all of diet culture's rules about nutrition, and that can feel really scary, but that's actually kind of the point. Like, you need to break free from those rules and reclaim your connection to your desires and your ability to take pleasure in food, plus learn to honor your hunger cues and all of the rest of the principles of intuitive eating before you can re-engage with nutrition in a way that's not infused with diet culture. So gentle nutrition is a part of intuitive eating in the long term, and that's part of what makes intuitive eating a good approach for your health in the long term, better than diets, even the most quote unquote flexible diet. But gentle nutrition is the last principle of intuitive eating for a reason. Because if you approach nutrition too early, you're just going to be doing it through the lens of diet culture, which you're already doing it from, which all of us in diet culture, diet culture is infused into the way that we learn about nutrition from the start because of our culture, because of how we talk about bodies and food and label foods as good and bad and all the rest. So it's going to take some time to get rid of those diet culture ideas and be able to use nutrition as a piece of information, as one source of information for your own self-care, and integrate that outside information with your inner awareness and inner attunement to your body and its needs and its desires. And so in the short term, you're probably going to feel like you're prioritizing your body's needs and your mind's needs and desires above the nutrition rules and stuff that you've learned about, especially if you've gone to school for any sort of health profession. And that can feel scary, but just trust that if you get through that, you're going to be in such a better position for your long-term health. And that if you stay on the diet cycle, even the so-called flexible dietary control, or like watching what you eat that a lot of people do in diet culture, that's actually going to put your health at greater risk in the long term, because it's going to make you more likely to weight cycle, which is independently associated with negative health outcomes as well. It's going to make you more subject to weight stigma because you're still staying within the diet culture framework of, I can't let my body get too large. I can't let my body be what it wants to be. I always have to control it. I always have to be watching it. And if that's not weight stigma, I don't know what is, right? It's internalized weight stigma. It's you doing it to yourself. And there's actually some research showing that internalized weight stigma has an even greater impact on people's health than just weight stigma coming from the outside. So that's definitely something to consider. So basically, these months or years or whatever it is of the honeymoon phase that you're in are not going to irreparably damage your health. They're not going to make your health suffer. They might, cause some digestive discomfort for the short term or things like that, but it's not going to irreparably damage your health to let yourself have permission to eat these foods. So as you can probably glean from all of this, the process of relearning intuitive eating is really complex, and there's a lot to think about. There's a lot of nuance, which is why I teach an online course about it, and I give lifetime access to people in the course so that they can really take the time to relearn intuitive eating, because breaking free from diet culture in all of its sneaky forms is really challenging, and it takes time, and it also takes support, which is why why I also have a private community in that course, because people need to have somewhere to go for support when they're going through the inevitable ups and downs of the intuitive eating process and dealing with everybody else around them who's steeped in diet culture. So if you're ready to really dive into healing your own relationship with food, check out that course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. That'll really walk you through in a much more systematic way how to make peace with food, how to trust your body's instincts and intuition about what you want to eat, and prioritize pleasure above diet culture rules and the nutrition rules that you've learned from our healthcare system, because those are very much steeped in diet culture as well. So I hope that helps give you some ammunition to fight back against the diet mentality in your own life. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. There's also still a few days left to join my Master Your Anti-Diet Message course if you're listening to this episode the day that it drops. The seminar is for fellow health and wellness pros who know that diet culture has controlled the conversation in our field for way too long, like the way that nutrition is infused with diet culture that I was just speaking about, and for people who know that it's high time for a change and want to be part of that change. If you're ready to stop taking part in diet culture's version of health, start advocating for non-diet approaches that truly help your clients' and audience's well-being, build a thriving brand that magnetizes people who are ready for change, and help them break free from dieting and disordered eating for good, this workshop is for you. You can still register up until the date of the workshop, which is June 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, so definitely don't miss it. And there's a replay available for folks who can't make it on that day, so sign up even if you can't be there live. But if you can, it's a great opportunity to ask me your questions too. Just go to christyharrison.com/message to sign up. That's christyharrison.com/message. Today's show is brought to you by the Splendid Table podcast. The Splendid Table is the show for curious cooks and eaters. Host Francis Lamb and his guests provide a fresh, multicultural snapshot of the food world, from the art, culture, and science behind our food to simply great cooking and eating. The Splendid Table has been called an outstanding food podcast by New York Magazine and was named one of the top 5 podcasts of the year by Today. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Elizabeth Scott. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Growing up, I had a pretty healthy relationship with food. I had a mother who modeled healthy eating. She ate with a lot of gusto and appetite. There was a lot of pleasure in food in my family. My father loved fresh fruit and vegetables and farmers markets, and he would do things in big sizes, like cases and cases of peaches. And I remember a camping trip once where he bought cases and cases of artichokes because we were traveling in California and we were East Coasters, so we never got to eat so many artichokes as we did on that camping trip. With a huge camped pot, we would put 50 artichokes in there and then just eat them for days with butter melting from the heat of the summer day as we traveled along in our van. So that my relationship with my food and my body image was healthy and pretty vital when I was growing up.
I read on your bio that your mother was a feminist therapist. Do you think that had something to do with the positive, relationship with food and body that was being modeled for you?
I think so. She emerged as a therapist in my teen years, and there were a lot of awesome feminists sitting around my kitchen table talking about our relationship to our bodies, talking about, Kim Shernan and fat as a feminist issue, and asking a lot of questions that gave me the critical thinking to negotiate some of the messages that I was receiving then and then later in my development, so that I was able to resist the cultural messages that were really destructive. I had a couple rounds in my late, early 20s with dieting and restricting and trying to change my body. And it never worked. There was never any change that would happen. I would just get neurotic and obsessed with food and miserable, and my body would be exactly the same before and after. And so I finally abandoned those things. It wasn't helpful. And I always had that feminist analysis in the back of my mind, like, why am I doing this? Why are women preoccupied with changing their bodies? Why aren't men preoccupied with cleansing and improving upon their bodies? And this idea of women's bodies as being disgusting and unclean, that's not a new idea. That's an old idea. Do I really want to be part of that? So that was very helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like it was really helpful in sort of shaping your worldview, and it didn't save you from getting caught up in diet culture for a little bit, but at least it helped you
No.
come out of it, which
Right.
is so interesting. I know a number of clients that I've had and listeners to the podcast have told me that they've been raised feminist and they were ardently feminist and yet still struggle with an eating disorder and feel
Hmm.
kind of an intense shame about that. So I think it's
Right.
really worth saying that, like, it doesn't necessarily save you from falling prey to the diet culture stuff, but it can be sort of a bolster out of it eventually.
Exactly. It can be a resource. And it probably saved me from going further into it because I was a dancer. So I certainly had a lot of risk factors.
Yeah, what was that like? What messages were you hearing in your relationship with your body and dance, and how did that play out?
Yeah, well, they conflicted with each other as well because I studied West African dance and Haitian dance, and there was a lot of affirmation of the female body. And my dance teacher would tie a pillow to my butt to say, move it, let it move, let it be bigger, let it happen. And so that was encouraging. But I also studied ballet, and so I had a Russian ballet teacher who would hit me with this little stick she carried in the class on the thighs and say, "Too fat," as she went by.
Ugh.
And I remember feeling enraged. So I had enough of a feminist analysis to be like, who are you to be whacking my thighs and telling me too fat? And so I was able to resist her aggression.
How old were you at the time?
In my 20s, it was college. So, 20 and 21.
That's really powerful to have that kind of sense of self at that point.
Yeah, it helped a lot. I was grateful to my mother.
Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in how that feminist discourse sort of played out in adolescence too, because I know that when I was a teenager and so many of my clients and people I know were teenagers, that was such a time of body shame and all of the stuff we'd heard about bodies sort of all throughout our lives up till that point kind of coming to the fore and being like
Right.
sort of in our face. So
Mm-hmm.
your relationship with your own body as it changed and as you went through puberty, I'm sure must have been sort of fraught. Were you getting positive messages about that from your mom at that point?
I wasn't with my mom. Well, at puberty I was. And yes, and her messages were very positive and, a lot of sense of humor about the humiliations of the body and her aging and menopause, and a lot of laughter in my house about that. I lived in a lesbian collective at the time with her, and I remember her and her partner were both going through menopause at the same time, and they would sleep head to toe because if they slept with their heads next to each other, they would get so overheated that everybody would wake up and have hot flashes. So it was hysterical. I'd come in their room in the morning and there'd be a head sticking out at each end of the top and bottom of the bed. And so there was a lot of humor and fun about just the bodies and how difficult they can be and how to put up with being loving and inventive about responding to the difficulties. And then I was experiencing a positive sexual development and waking up to that aliveness. And so I did pretty well. I was pretty protected from cultural messages that were really, misogynistic about women's bodies and about fat and development.
That's really lucky.
It can make a difference. I mean, like you said, you can grow up with a lot of feminist ideas and still be snowed by the culture or by other disruptions in your healthy development of embodiment, like, assault or sexual assault or, individual instances that can throw you for 10 years. But I was lucky enough to avoid that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's definitely worth saying too, because eating disorders and disordered eating issues or body image issues aren't just about diet culture. They're also about these traumatic things that happen to us, which then, of course, it's like we get kind of sucked into diet culture through that opening.
Right, exactly. And I'm very interested in the work of Neva Perrand, who's done a lot of research about women's, what she calls the healthy development of embodiment. And she's done long-term research about the environmental impacts that disrupt women's embodiment and then the environmental impacts that support and resource a woman's healthy embodiment. And we don't have to it doesn't have to be perfect, but there needs to be enough positive support for us to get through what has become a very common period of disruption, which is that adolescent period. And then there's other ones, as we age, just to be able to have enough support to get through and get to what healthy embodiment is, which is to be in your body in an alive and passionate way and unconflicted about your appetites and desire and with a voice.
That's really powerful. And I think that also it's such a good point that it's not like a perfectionistic thing. It sounds like there's a sort of level of like good enoughness.
Enough, exactly. She's just published a wonderful book that's a treatise on a huge piece of research she did of individual interviews with hundreds of girls and women and just about their body story and analyzing what were the environmental influences that led to the disruption in those that were disrupted and that led to that wholeness and successful embodiment in the women who were able to do that. And the wonderful thing is we modeled our research approach at the Body Positive after her feminist dialogical model. In the beginning, that's how we came up with our model, was by asking people, what are the messages you get about your food and your body? How do they make you feel? What behaviors do these messages lead to? And what are you going to do about it? Really challenging them to come up with solutions. And the solutions that they came up with is how we developed our model. And then for years and years, we've taught people our body positive model and really helped them to be resourced against disruptions in embodiment, against, eating disorders and body image and other types of terrible self-care. And we've had these beautiful outcomes with so many high school and college students. And the thing that's wonderful reading Neva's research now is all of her conclusions support what we've figured out from listening to people. And the outcome is the same. And so I'm so glad I didn't have to do all those years of research. I could just do the community organizing part and really reach a lot of people and be supported by what she's figured out.
Yeah, and sort of the lived experience part of it, right? You had facilitated people in having that experience for themselves.
Yeah, it was just a grassroots thing. And she talks about how for girls, the girls who came through their adolescence successfully in terms of embodiment, some of them had just one person in their life who was healthily in their bodies and who saw them and recognized them and supported their healthy embodiment and their beauty and just saw who they were. And that just that could be enough, even with many conditions that were, detrimental. And so I'm hoping, of course, that the body positive could be that influence in someone's life.
Yeah, I hope the same with my work as well. And I feel like it's really heartening to know it only takes one.
Right. Isn't that encouraging? And that's good data, like with hundreds of people where they're really seeing that it was this one aunt or it was this one school program or just one thing that opened up their eyes and they were like, wait a minute, I'm going to resist these messages. I'm not going to fold and try to transform my body so that I can find acceptance, because that will never work.
Mm-hmm. And what I've learned about adolescent development too, which really squares with my lived experience of being an adolescent, was that like adolescence is a time when kids are questioning everything and suddenly authority doesn't really mean as much. And you're like, wait a minute, why do I have to do that just because you say I do, Right. And if we can channel that and help people understand, like, here's another authority that's trying to keep you down. Like diet culture is something that you don't have to acquiesce to. You don't have to do what it says. In fact, you should challenge it. You should question it. That sort of harnesses what kids, teenagers at that point in their life are sort of developmentally experiencing already, which is this like fierce kind of rebellion.
Exactly. And you're exactly right about the power of harnessing their developmental imperative for autonomy. But advertising and marketing is onto that as well. And that's where they are also trying to harness their rebelliousness and say, you don't have to be fat and unwanted, and you don't have to be this and that. You can just buy this product and then you can be free and independent. It's like Virginia Slims harnessing the women's movement, And so they're a lot more sophisticated than we are and bigger. And so we have this huge message with some of the brightest psychologists in the world are consulting to advertising and marketing. So we need to resist fiercely and in a powerful grassroots effort in order to counter those same forces that would harness them. And I think you're absolutely right. If you can show a girl, look, you think you're rebelling by not eating your mother's food, but you're actually conforming to a much bigger authority. And so, what is real freedom? What is real rebellion? This way of being, listening to the authority of your own experience and listening inside and finding out through trial and error what you really need. That's going to be the really powerful thing. And it's, we're fighting against huge forces, but I have found that sometimes it really does take only that small validation of their own experience and they get it.
Yeah, that's huge. I think that point is so well taken too, that like these are huge forces that are also trying to harness the same rebellious impulse in teenagers, and so that advertisers can get their money, get them to spend money on things and they're emerging as a new force of spenders as well, as a new force,
right.
A new crop of consumers. So if advertisers can hook them early, that's a way to get a customer for life and get them to spend thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and just to insert that critical thinking, which all of the work at the Body Positive is just about asking questions. We don't prescribe people how to think or what to feel or what to do. But just to ask questions, to insert that critical thinking, that autonomy, that feminist approach of not having top-down dominating theoretical models, but to be asking over and over, what works for you? What are you hungry for? Are you hungry? When are you satisfied? And if you're not hungry for food, what are you really hungry for? And so figuring out what are the good questions. And that's what our whole model is built on, is what are the good questions about this and what are the good questions about that? And until people can find out for themselves what's true.
I love that. And I want to talk a little bit about how you got into that work. Like, how did you go from being in your early 20s and having your own dabbling with dieting to starting an organization or co-founding an organization that, helps people break free from that stuff?
Well, I went to graduate school in social work and started my own private practice in Marin County in 1988. And no one had mentioned in graduate school eating disorders, body image, or even the fact that my clients had bodies. There was really no training. And then probably 1 out of every 2 people who walked through the door of my office had a disruption in their embodiment. There was some problem with body hatred or eating, or I was completely overwhelmed. And I didn't have any training, so I was studying with some wonderful women at Beyond Hunger, which is a little treatment program and nonprofit in Marin County. And they were teaching me about a non-diet health at every size approach. And I learned about what is effective for eating disorders treatment. But I was unhappy being a social worker. I'm always sort of 1 foot in community activism and organizing and 1 foot in clinical work. So I went across the street and knocked on the door of the high school and said, look, I'm having a girl a month come out of this school and into my office with a food and eating problem. What's happening over here? Can we do some prevention? I need to move upstream. This is demoralizing because by the time they get to me, they're already 3 years of suffering in and 3 years of loss and preoccupation and obsession. And I hate this. It's making me crazy. So they invited me to work with a couple of girls who were in recovery and start doing some classroom education. And in the classroom, there was a lot of interest. And we started a drop-in group and 100 girls came. So we were like, wow, this feels more like a movement than a support group. We need to really address this. And we started talking to teachers and school staff and the board. And around that time, Connie called me, Connie Subcheck, who's the co-founder of the Body Positive. And she said, I've heard about the groups that you're doing, and I'm interested in starting a nonprofit called the Body Positive that works to raise the consciousness of teenagers about eating and body image problems. And I need to end this whole epidemic before my daughter grows up. She had just lost a sister to an eating disorder. And she had a 3-year-old daughter, and she had suffered with an eating disorder herself. And she was just like, this has to end right here in this generation. And I was like, yes, I feel exactly the same way. So we took the girls who were already leaders at the high school at Tam High that I was working with, and we started a nonprofit. And we started doing a pilot of a model where we would train leaders because we were really interested in peer-led change. And they would do classroom education, teacher education, parent education, and really work to change the culture of the school. And we were studying Neva Perron's work, which is how she did things, was asking kids about what changes needed to happen and then helping them make them. And that's how the Body Positive was started. We got funding just right that year. We've been rolling ever since. That was in 1996.
Wow, that's so huge. And things have changed so much since then in so many ways. It's like, I feel like body positivity is now a thing. It's become...
I know, it's like a noun.
Yeah.
Or it's cool.
No, it is. It's a movement, or it's
a household word.
Right. Yeah, it's a household word, and one that's now been co-opted by big business as well, and, turned into a way to...
Yeah, we have to fight to hold the reins on the body positive movement because, yeah, it's sexy, it's alive, and Coke wants it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to stay out front of this movement by continuing to define it instead of to let it be sold.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I appreciate that perspective, because I think some people have come along that are of my generation, like in their early to mid 30s or whatever, didn't go through the period of sort of defining it that you did, and your generation was able to create this concept of body positivity. You and Connie created this notion of the body positive that was very rooted and very grounded in fat activism and in health at every size and in like true feminist principles. And then I think so many people have seen this movement, this term get co-opted, that a lot of my contemporaries are like, well, fuck body positive. What we really need is fat activism, and we need to go back to those roots. And this body positive thing is just a distraction, or is just a co-opted sort of term that doesn't mean anything anymore. But it's like, hold on, it's not just that. There is that piece of it, yes, but the real roots of it and the real meaning of it is actually a lot deeper and more important.
You're so right. I mean, health at every size and fat activism is an aspect of the body positive movement, and it's the foundation of it. But there's so much more to having an alive, embodied relationship to your body at whatever size you are. There's more than just about fat and thin. There's also race and other identities and gender. And there's pieces about reclaiming our beauty from a marketing standard and reclaiming our beauty to be able to look at our bodies as art rather than as, do we match up to this ideal of marketing? So I think it's true. I can see how people, activists in your generation, might feel disillusioned, like, look, it's already been sold down the river. Now we have body positive clothing layouts. And of course that's going to happen. But in a way, that's an affirmation of the work we're doing, because people are wanting some of that mojo. And we just need to keep, we want it to get so big that it becomes a movement, so that sixth graders today don't ever know of a time where they didn't know about the body positive. But we do need to keep steering it so it doesn't become a commodity.
Right. That's such a great way to frame it. And I think your work, and Sonia Renee Taylor is someone else that I see doing really great work around radical body positivity and framing it as radical, and reminding people that like it is about race and gender and sexuality and all of the aspects of our bodies that are actually such important social justice issues.
Exactly. And I admire Sonia Renee Taylor so much. And keeping that radical edge, it's an ongoing movement. It's not like we can get static and just keep teaching the same thing over and over again, because we have to keep looking at the way our various intersecting identities impact how we inhabit our bodies, and the permission that we have to be out in the world expressing our own true selves in the bodies that we have, and how much this whole idea of perfecting our bodies and becoming this idealized height and weight, and how much those ideals are connected to other totalitarian ideas like racism and white privilege. That white privilege is very tangled with perfectionism. This idea to be white, the burden of white privilege is this idea that we need to dance on this head of the pin in order to maintain all of our privileges, which alienates us from people, from the humans, from being part of humanity. And it's what needs to be deconstructed in order to change racism, is that white people, people who enjoy privilege, need to recognize how our participation causes us to suffer, and how we can let go of being this ideal, perfect thing that enjoys all these privileges, and instead join in the human race and have company and community and be advocates and allies to people with less privilege.
Yeah, so well said. And I'm working on a book right now, and I have a chapter on the history of diet culture. So I've been looking at the sort of genesis of it, and it really, the thin ideal and the idea that larger bodies are somehow bad really comes out of racist ideas about hierarchies of bodies and who's the supposedly more evolved races, like this mid 1800s ideas about evolutionary biology that were very steeped in
eugenics.
Exactly. It's like we know where that went.
We know where that. It smells like eugenics. It feels like eugenics. It seems to be right in that same camp, and it's such a tired old idea.
Oh, so tired and so problematic and harmful. And we saw what happened with those ideas underlying, the Nazis and the rise of that movement like that.
Well, and we can see it up close and center right now in our culture. The message is the same. There's an us and a them, and we're more pure and more entitled and deserve more than them. And that those messages, it's just a human thing. You can call it fundamentalism, or you can call it imperialism, whatever you want to call it. It's a human thing where we act out of fear, and we start othering people out of fear. And at the Body Positive, we just try to keep it simple, that fundamentally you have a choice whether you're going to act from your fears or whether you're going to turn towards your fears with some bravery, with some kindness, with some mercy, and figure out what you're really afraid of and what you need, and find the resources to be brave so that you can face difference and loss and grief and endless change and impermanence with some style and some heart. And so rather than naming and blaming, really just taking a look at what are our fears and can we take responsibility for them so that we're not acting out of them in a way that's violent and harmful to other living things.
I love that. And that is, it is such the thing at the core of fundamentalism, or whatever you want to call it.
Totalitarianism, Nazism.
Totalitarianism, fascism, Nazism, all of it is this fear. This fear of the other.
I won't have what I need, and so I'm going to get violent instead of like, we're in this together. Let's solve this with our unlimited creativity and intelligence.
Yeah, and in the sort of the way that diet culture has co-opted that or has become a part of that. It's like the hierarchy of bodies and the idea that thinner is better is being used to oppress people who don't match up to that, which now is really 95 or more % of us don't match up to the idealized thinness that is sold to us all the time in advertising and media. And the further outside of that you fall, of course, the more marginalized you are, the more stigma you experience in society, such that I experience thin privilege and still don't match up to that supposed ideal. But I've never, had someone yell animal names at me as I'm walking down the street because of the size of my body, which is an experience that...
or beat you up.
Exactly. Or, assault me. So.
Well, and it's the same groups. It's not that big a change, because then a lot of the hatred that's freely now allowed to be directed at fat bodies is directed at the brown and black bodies as well. And really, when people are talking about weight, they're also often talking about race. It's just a slightly more socially acceptable way to hate on people or to talk about it in terms of health. And no, it's not about race. It's not about weight. It's just, I really am worried about your health.
Right.
And I've just never seen a high correlation between shame and hatred and improved self-care. So I'm not quite sure how somebody's hating on my body is going to lead to improved health for me.
And that's what makes it so transparent, these concern trolling ideas about health. I mean, there are people I think who genuinely are sort of deluded, and I was one of them for a long time, into thinking like, no, but quote unquote obesity is just bad for your health, and it's our mission as a society to solve the obesity epidemic. That was my paradigm going into school as a dietitian, because I was so steeped in diet culture, and that's what I knew.
And that's what they teach you in the dietitian school.
Exactly. That's what they teach you. And that's what you get from all sides. And to be a sort of good dietitian, quote unquote, you're supposed to know how to shrink someone's body. And so there's that piece of it. There's like those of us who kind of unwittingly just fell in line with this oppressive system, and we think it's, what we're supposed to do. And I think the folks who are compassionate and who think about this stuff critically, that's really who I'm talking to in this podcast. It's like the people who are like, there's something not right here, and I'm curious and I want to know more, and can wake up out of that. I think those are the folks that are going to change the world. But then there are the ones who use health as a smokescreen, as a guise to deflect the real racism or animus underneath it, which is, the concern trolls that sometimes populate my Instagram feed, or those of many fat activists that I know. It's like the people who are like using health as a bludgeon, and that it's just the most convenient bludgeon they have. It's not actually something they care about.
Well, and I do try to reach across to people who are in that belief set. And the way that I do, what I say when I'm teaching the body positive curriculum to people is, if you find yourself in a conversation with people in the church of dieting, and they're talking to you about your health, and you're starting to cite statistics and facts and research, you've already taken a wrong turn, because that's not the level on which you're going to change people. What you need to be talking about, if you're talking about, like, say, this fat person, and they want to talk about it's bad for their health, and you want to say, well, what about health at every size? Instead, I think what's valuable to talk about is the person, the human being. What is their experience? How have they suffered? What traumas have impacted them? What health issues have caused them to gain weight? What ancestors did they come from, and how did they carry trauma in their bodies? And how have they lived being fat, and what's their experience? And so we start just by asking people to share an experience of sizeism that they've had in their life, whether it's something that was directed at them, or a privilege that they were able to enjoy as a result of being closer to the ideal size, or an oppression that they observed happening to someone else. It doesn't really matter. If you get 60 people talking about their experience of sizeism, and then it gets to be a lot harder to talk about, well, but if they were thinner, then they'd be healthier and their blood pressure would go down. It's like, well, really, let's take a look at how much suffering is involved in gaining the weight in this culture, and in living in a larger body in this culture, and how tangled it is with oppression and suffering and abuse and beauty and ancestors. And then let's take it from there. And it brings the whole conversation down to a much more real and embodied and emotional conversation.
I love that, because it's refusing to play by the rules of the people who want to put it in terms of health, and, which is really a sanitized version of weight stigma.
Exactly. And even if you're just by yourself and you just make yourself vulnerable talking about what your struggle has been, all of a sudden, if people aren't going to say, no, you didn't struggle like that. They're not, they don't have much to stand on when you're just sharing your pain. Whereas when you're talking about statistics and facts and blood pressure and cholesterol, there's going to be a lot more arguing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often tell people that too when they ask, how to deal with the naysayers in their lives. And oftentimes someone will be like, well, my brother is a personal trainer and, is all about paleo, or my sister-in-law is convinced that gluten is the devil, and she has all this science that she's, claims backs her up. And it's like, people want to engage on that level because that's the level that other people are coming at them. But I often say too, like, if you can ask for what you need and ask to not have to talk about this stuff with them, like set the boundary and say, I'm not comfortable having these kinds of conversations. These are really problematic for me because of my experience in my own body or my experience in my relationship with food. And obviously you have to be safe with a person, feel safe enough to open up to them like that and know that they're not going to be terrible to you when you reveal that to them. But I think when you can say, like, this has been my experience and I've suffered because of this kind of weight biased attitude or this kind of healthist, diet culture in another form kind of rhetoric, there's a lot more space then for someone to say, oh, well, okay, at least maybe I can honor your wish to not talk about food and dieting and exercise and stuff.
Absolutely. I think that's a brilliant message. I think first reflect, do I have the energy to have this conversation with this person at this time? And if it's no, then don't have it, because you're going to be in a disempowered situation if you're exhausted trying to convert somebody who doesn't listen. On the other hand, if you have the energy, lead from your experience and talk about the suffering, not about statistics and numbers. And then you will be in a much more empowered position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to think about vulnerability as the secret superpower that actually sort of charges up those conversations and gives you more of a solid base from which to advocate, because people think that vulnerability makes them weak. I think that's the sort of white supremacist culture kind of version of, it's like everything has to be so intellectual. We have to talk about facts and numbers and science. But actually, if we're talking about more human emotions and we're talking, speaking as human beings from a place of vulnerability and a place of our own experience.
And our own authority.
Yeah.
Where we do have authority.
Right. Because we may not have all the facts and figures at our fingertips, but we are always the ultimate authority on ourselves and our own experience.
Right. That's so right on, Christy.
It's funny. I'm going to be doing a debate. I got roped into doing this debate on health at every size versus weight management at our national conference for dietitians this year. And it was supposed to be, it was originally framed as a conversation. And then the organizers were like, we want it to be a debate. How's that? And I'm like annoyed by the fact that, it's being framed as a debate, because of course what it's going to be is the weight management side is going to be all about, these numbers and talking about.
Okay, but their numbers are bad.
Right. And I can certainly, deconstruct that and talk about that and the bias in research and show some other numbers about how weight stigma plays a role in all these health outcomes and stuff like that.
I don't know if you even should go all that way. I don't know if you should.
Yeah. I mean, talking about it now, I'm thinking like, really the most important thing that I want to communicate is the idea that weight stigma is harmful to people, and that as health providers, we're sworn to do no harm, and weight stigma does real harm. And so let's look at that.
Perfect. And then even to get more vulnerable with my patients, that putting them on a diet hasn't worked.
Mm-hmm.
It made them miserable, preoccupied with food, exacerbated their eating disordered symptoms if they had a history, invented new symptoms if they didn't, and it made them miserable and hating their bodies. So I don't want to make my clients more unhappy. And what if it's not possible to get everybody thin? You haven't done it.
Right. You
haven't succeeded 95% of the time. So I'm looking for a less iatrogenic approach. And it's not perfect. Some people still get sick, get old, and die. In fact, we're all going to do that.
Yeah.
But so what are we going to do about lovingly connecting and finding the most meaningful life we can have with these imperfect bodies?
Yes. And having a meaningful life and a life that fulfills us without spending all this time spinning our wheels on something that doesn't actually work anyway.
And promote self-loathing.
Yes.
It is correlated with self-loathing and obsession with food and emotional lability. It also doesn't happen to have any good health outcomes. But I just don't want you fighting about all those nitty-gritty details, because you're on the wrong message when you're doing that.
Right.
Instead of saying, but my clients who are fat have suffered so much injustice and poor health and depression and anxiety and trauma. I want to respond to them in a way that is going to be effective, give them things they can control, like their self-care.
Right. And give them things that actually make them feel autonomous and competent. And, what are it's like the three core needs that everybody has: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Right.
Give them things that meet those needs so that they can have the greatest well-being that they're able to have, rather than thwarting all of those needs with prescriptions that don't actually work and that take them away from their own agency and their own inner wisdom.
Right. And if you're just vulnerable and just say, I may have given these recommendations in the past and increased people's self-loathing and put them further onto the spin of behaviors that they couldn't maintain and didn't lead to good outcomes anyway, and that hurts my soul. I'm not willing to do that anymore. And so I need to talk to them about not what they should do, because that doesn't work with humans, because their autonomy is, cut in two. But I want to talk to them about what would motivate your somewhat increasing your self-care. And it is not self-loathing, I guarantee you.
Absolutely.
What motivates improved self-care is self-love.
Yes, 100%.
And what supports self-love and self-care is social relationships that are nurturing and supportive. And so, I wouldn't even go into that conversation about what fat people should do.
Right. And I think it's, when talking to fellow health professionals, and I know there's a lot of folks listening who also work in the health and wellness field and, work in things related to food and body stuff, that so many of us went through our training and our early parts of our careers doing the diet culture thing, towing the party line, giving that kind of prescriptive advice, and seeing that it wasn't working and seeing that our clients were suffering and feeling bad, because it's like, as a health professional, as someone who's trying to do good, and especially as someone who's just finding their footing in their career, it's like, oh God, I did something wrong here. I'm doing a bad job, and that feels bad, and we go into these professions because we want to help people.
Right. It's totally against what your impulse is, which is to help people. And I actually feel that RDs, dietitians, are wonderfully positioned to forward the body movement, but have no training how to do that. Dietitians are taught what people should do, and nothing about the enormous discovery made 100 years ago by Freud, the unconscious, nothing about the psychology of people and what motivates them to take care of themselves. So you can go through a whole program where you know exactly what people should eat and how they should eat and what they should do, and then be thrown into an eating disorders treatment center where people won't eat in the first place. And so to me, if dietitians can just learn the body positive model and learn what you're teaching around the psychological aspects and the power aspects and the social aspects that influence our self-care, they're in the best position to forward the movement, because people come to them to talk about their food.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel like when there's such power in having someone come to you to talk about their food and say, I'm really struggling in my relationship with food. I want to stop binging. I feel like I need to eat healthier and I don't know how to do it. And for the dietitian to give permission and say, you know what, you can drop those shoulds. You don't have to do anything that you've been told you're supposed to do by this diet culture. Let's talk about what you actually want. Let's talk about what your body's actually telling you. Let's talk about what you already know to be true about your own desires, about your own body, about your own needs. Like the sort of freedom and the it's like there's this unexpectedness to it that I think is so enriching. It's like this
and liberating.
Yeah,
it feels liberating.
It does.
It lifts it off of them.
And it feels so good to work with people when you can see it click for them like that. And when they're like,
absolutely,
oh my God, you're telling me I have permission. They're like giddy sometimes, that's wonderful.
Absolutely. You can work on it over time in little areas, trial and error. A short-term solution isn't going to make a bit of difference. What matters is sustainable change. And so, this is your body. You own it. You can learn from the environment, but then what works for you? And through trial and error, which involves error, so you're going to need to cultivate self-love to deal with failure and disappointment, because that's what error is. But through trial and error over time, you can approximate the best self-care you can have. And you will still get sick and die. So this isn't a competition for who's going to do it perfectly and then become immortal and forever white and privileged. That's not going to happen. You're still going to be a mere mortal with health problems and issues, and then you're going to get sick and die. If you're lucky, and don't get bumped off by a truck. So this is the encouraging words, like just what you talk about, like they come in looking for a prescription, which they can then throw away and not do. Mm-hmm. And you say, I'm not doing that. I'm not participating in oppressing you. I'm going to give you tools to figure this out on your own. If you want specific information, I will share it, and it still might not work for you. You still have to figure it out for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And the unlearning piece, I think, is so important too. It's like people come in wanting the learning. They want the knowledge. They want the prescription for what to do. But I'm often like, we got to undo first because you already know so much. You already know too much, but it's from diet culture. It's from an oppressive system. And it's a lot of knowledge that actually serves to undermine your own autonomy and your own competence in your relationship with food and your body. So we got to undo that. And then we can talk about the knowledge that might actually benefit you. But I think, oftentimes people will want to jump to the place of like, let me think about which foods work for me or don't work for me. How does gluten make me feel or whatever? It's like, okay, we're not even going to go there right now, because the way that you're approaching it is still coming from this oppressive place of diet culture, and it's going to end badly. It's going to end up in the same way that all the other knowledge has ended up for you, which is a tool to bludgeon yourself with, and we don't want that.
Exactly. That'll still fail. The other thing I love about dietitians is I think you are in your profession often embedded in systems like, working with all the athletes at a college or working with all of the company members at a company, where you're really in a position, everybody's coming to you to talk about self-care. And if you can just add this piece about the psychology and the liberation and how to come to trust and support your own autonomy, you're really in a position to change culture in those environments.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your saying that. And I feel like that's very true and gives sort of a lot of courage to dietitians, I think, a lot of hope. Because I think sometimes I get letters from dietitian to bees, people in training programs being like, I don't even know if I want to go through with this. I don't know if I can keep doing this because the training itself is so weight biased. But I think if you can, and I don't know if I've shared this on the podcast before, but I almost quit my dietetic internship. I was so close, but I got an offer I was already working freelance on this book, and I got a bunch of new assignments on my plate. And I was like, I'm making good money with this. I don't have any time with my school program to work on this. And I have all this nutrition knowledge and had gone to school and got my master's of public health and done all the dietetic practice requirements already. And I was like, what if I just leave with the master's and say that I'm like a, nutritional consultant or whatever? And thankfully, I had this amazing internship director who happened to be in a larger body and was super fat positive, but didn't explicitly say that. She just was, Mm-hmm. And she was like, no, you need to stay. You need to stick this out. You're so close. Please stay. And I was so glad I did, because having those letters after my name make all the difference. It really does help with of conferring authority in systems and situations where someone's not going to listen to you unless you have those letters.
Well, and having those letters and then building momentum outside of schools can give you the authority and power to go back towards those school systems and say, you're teaching this anachronistic stuff that it isn't showing up in the data. It's not working. And so you need to take into account the whole person, and that includes their psyche and their social relations and their embeddedness in culture. And so let's take a look at these things and make it part of the education of a well-rounded dietitian.
Right. And I think I'm seeing now some of my colleagues doing that, especially in Australia, like Fiona Willer and Fiona Sutherland are doing a lot of education in university systems. In the US, there's Marcy Evans and Lisa Pearl, people are doing some amazing things as dietitians.
And they need support because there's a lot of pushback. And a lot of the dietitians that come to body positive facilitator trainings, which they make up about half of who we train. We train high school and college leaders and also other professionals like psychotherapists and clinical treatment folks. But registered dietitians come, we give CEs, but they also are just so positioned to learn this piece. They have all the rest of the knowledge. And then when they learn the body positive piece, they're like, okay, now my profession makes sense. Now I feel like I can follow my heart and have some language and some research and some background to support it. And then they do incredible work, and just one by one in their work worlds.
And I think it is the thing that's missing from so much of our education as dietitians, and really a lot of health professionals too, this idea of motivation and psychology and the larger social issues. Because I think dietitians learn in their training that, a lot of people aren't going to necessarily take your advice, and that it's going to be, a hard road to try to get people to listen to you and do the things you're recommending. And there's this sense that like, okay, it is the rare person who's actually going to take these ideas and run with them or take the advice you're giving.
Right. So how depressing.
Right. And like, we're depressed and we're scratching our heads being like, why is that? What's up with this system?
So never mind, just keep suggesting it. Never mind that most people will resist it.
Yeah.
So good luck with that. You might get tired in 20 minutes.
I know. Exactly.
Pretty soon, if you just are more fierce, and what I see with people who are stuck in that model is they just start pulling out the big guns. And before long, they're like, you're going to die young of diabetes and heart.
Oh, yeah.
You don't listen to me.
Right. The scare tactics.
And so the clients get so anxious that they just go home and take care of themselves in the way they know how to, which might be binging.
Right. It doesn't do anything to help them actually engage in better self-care. It just creates a lot of fear.
No, because feeling self-regulated and loving and kind leads to better self-care, not feeling afraid of dying.
Right. Yeah. And I think for anyone listening who's had those scare tactics thrown at them, I think it's probably helpful to hear us have this discussion and recognize that dietitians are people too, health professionals are people too. They've been trained in this model that only gives them one set of tools that don't work very well. And so their last recourse, if they feel like they're not making a difference with someone, is usually to like throw the tools at them, which is not helpful and is actually hurtful. But it doesn't say anything about you as a person, actually. It's like if you've had that thrown at you that you're going to die early or that you're going to get diabetes because of your size, just know that it's not true and that it's the last recourse of someone who is feeling really desperate to try to help you.
Yeah, it's like they put a hex on you. And if you happen to be a dietitian or a professional who has done that, this is where forgiveness for yourself is also in order, because you did what you were trained to do. And now that you can wake up and think about the psychology of it and what really motivates the humans, you can change and you can start going back and doing something different.
Absolutely. Yeah, self-compassion, I think, is so important for this stuff because we all want to do good. We all want to help people. And it's really painful to know when we haven't and that something we've done is hurtful to them. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck with this stuff, where they sort of check out because they don't want to have to feel that pain of recognizing that they've done harm.
Exactly. And that's where I think people are coming from often. That's why, when we were talking before about you're talking to somebody who's born again dieting and you're trying to have an argument with them on an intellectual level and it's going badly, probably what you're up against is what you just described, which is the pain that they would feel if they let themselves know that they had harmed people with their approach. And so it's far more valuable to talk lovingly about the pain rather than argue with them on the level where they're all shut down.
Yeah. Which when you get into any sort of like numbers or science or whatever, there often is
exactly
that shutting down or that coalescing around what you already believe.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like your program is doing amazing things and that your work with students is really helping to change the culture at some of these schools that you're working with. What are some of the outcomes that you've seen with that?
Oh, so many. I mean, it's been 20 years that Connie Sobczak and I have been working on really developing a movement for body positivity around the world. And the most validating things lately, one has been Neva Paran's book, which her research supports everything we've done for 20 years. And also the research on our model that's happening at Cornell University. So for the past 2 years, Cornell University has been piloting our Be Body Positive model of peer-led leadership on campus, and they've been collecting data on the before and after of participants who attend student-led groups. So I trained the students, and the students then teach the body positive curriculum to their peers. And their peers at the end of the 8-week session were seeing improvements on so many measures. So in terms of their self-worth, their body image, their intuitive eating, resisting the thin ideals, social connectedness, resilience. But the most wonderful part of the data that's emerging is that 3 months after they finished the group, the measures all increased. So unlike most things that you implement where the benefits would decline afterwards, they improved. And that's the same data that we got at Stanford 3-4 years ago, where at 8 weeks, they were in better shape than they had been. But at 8 months out, they had moved from a mild to a moderate increase, which is awesome. I mean, that's really helpful to see. And these are preliminary studies. Actually, at Cornell this last semester, we have our first control group. And so we'll have some better quality measures, and those will be published in the fall. And it's exciting to have that data. But the program at Cornell has been really validating because they've really put a lot of energy and effort and campus resources towards supporting the body positive. Now they're hiring a staff person half-time just to supervise and implement the body positive so it can be institutionalized there. But they're reaching, they have a half a dozen groups running on campus in any given semester, and they're reaching into all these different communities on campus. Even the staff is having a group led by a staff member who came to the Be Body Positive training. And so they're really making change where the whole campus, it's starting to percolate. This is a body positive campus. We're really changing the culture, and we're seeing less suffering around body hatred and eating disorders, and more people challenging it and seeing how it intersects with racism and other forms of bias, so that people are more equipped to defend themselves and not get into all the behaviors that will destroy their college career.
Wow, that's amazing.
So that's been really validating. I'm so hungry to get my hands on the data, but we have to publish it first.
Yeah, that's always a process. Well, it's really interesting, this idea that all the measures of resilience, their self-esteem, all those things are better 8 months out or 6 months out than they were at the start. What do you think accounts for that?
I think that the ideas are heavyweight, big ideas. This like cultivating self-love, like looking at your beauty from the perspective of an artist instead of a marketing page, learning to eat and exercise intuitively, building community, thinking about health at every size, thinking about diversity and size and shape, and really embracing your ancestors as they show up in your body, resisting the inherent racist bias against certain ideal body types. These are things that take time to integrate. So these are bright people, right? These are Cornell students. And all of the people we serve, whether they're community or high school, whatever age, it takes time to practice this model. It's not a quick fix. It's not an 8-week diet. We're really challenging them to radically change the way they look at themselves and their relationship with their body and community. And that takes time. It takes time to integrate. And so I think over 8 months, we saw at Stanford, at 8 months, there was really a change. There was a marked change in how they related to themselves in terms of the critical voice and self-love, and in terms of body esteem, in terms of comparing themselves competitively, in terms of social relationships, and that competitive comparing model of building your self-worth, which is so hollow, instead of building your self-worth on compassion for your flawed and imperfect self, which allows you to join and be with other flawed and imperfect people, rather than being isolated in an ivory tower of perfection, which is pure misery.
Mm-hmm. And unattainable too. So
you're never there, but you're always stuck. It's just a paradox.
Yeah, you're in this purgatory.
Yeah, you're just stuck dancing on the head of a pin all by yourself, and nobody can even connect with you.
Mm. I feel that so deeply from my own past experience with an eating disorder and some of my clients that I've had who are really in it with eating disorders too. This sense of like, I hold myself to a higher standard. That was my refrain, and that's their refrain.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does that do to you then? What does that do to your ability to connect with other people?
It isolates you forever, and there's no entering that system. And so holding yourself to a higher standard, like for what? Why? What's the point of that? And what God are you serving who is so cruel, so Old Testament, what's the point of that?
Right. It's a really vengeful God that's wanting to lock you in that tower. Like,
it really is. And external to you. It isn't in your body, that God.
Right. That's not coming from you. That's not your inner wisdom. That's something you've inherited.
Exactly. It's that is not the truth about who you are.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really such great data and so empowering and inspiring to hear about. And it really squares with the experience that my clients have had, that I had myself, and that I think a lot of people listening to the podcast have probably had, where it does take a long time to integrate these ideas. And that can be scary at first. I get letters from people saying like, can you just tell me how long it's going to take? How long
forever
until I love my body, and it's like, and they're like, I'm 2 weeks into recovery. Like, how long is it going to really take? And it's like, yeah, it's going to be months. It's going to be years. It was probably decades that you were struggling with diet culture, that you were immersed in diet culture before this. So it's going to take a while to undo all those messages. Right. But just knowing that people's all those different measures are improving for people as time goes on, so that you can really see that marked difference even in 8 months is like, okay, so there's progress happening. You can sort of see it in these snapshots in time, and it's hard to feel for yourself necessarily as you go through time because you're just always with yourself. But just know that it really does work. It really is changing. And I feel like when I look back at my life 7 or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, especially when I was really in the worst of it, I can see it's like night and day. My life has so much more meaning, is so much richer, I'm such a happier person on a daily basis, all of that stuff.
And take stock. Take stock regularly. That's one, write it down. How are you doing in your body today? Compare that with 3 months ago. Write it, take stock of where you are so you can give yourself credit. Because what we're looking for is sustainable change and not a quick fix. And sustainable change, it takes time. You have to really build it into your life. And with a model like the Body Positive, there's all of the competencies are there. So if you work each one of those, you will arrive, and like you're saying, you have so much anecdotal experience of people becoming liberated and becoming more loving and more free. And what else is more important than that? What will make you more capable of serving others and of joining into the world in a way of making positive change than to have a more relaxed and peaceful relationship with your own body?
Yeah, and to have it not take up so much mental space. I feel like that's one of the biggest gifts of this, is just you have your time back, you have your energy back, you have your mind back to think about other things and not be so perseverating all the time on how many calories was this and how do I change my body like this and, all the things.
Yeah, it's such a terrible kind of suffering. It's so lonely.
It is.
Yeah, I feel so grateful to spend my career focusing on helping people become liberated from that obsession and that self-absorbed preoccupation with self-loathing, because what I see is it happens actually, in my experience, very quickly with the activists that come to our Be Body Positive facilitator trainings. It's like in a short time, in a period of months, they're really starting to turn that ship towards, how can I be of service in the world? I feel empowered. I feel alive and joyful. And yeah, I'm not perfect, but I'm just a flawed, imperfect human who has a lot to get done. And I can see that they're mobilized and going forward. And even now we have online trainings. And so people can access our material right in this moment and learn the model themselves just by taking the fundamentals course. It's so accessible. People could take it in Timbuktu. I had a call the other day from a woman from Poland who discovered the body positive. And she said, I'm in a consortium of people who are trying to end body hatred and eating disorders in Europe. There's 100 of us part of it. And we were just at a conference crying over the fact that we have no model and this work is so hard and they're so overwhelming with the whole marketing and beauty industries. And we were just despairing. And then I discovered the body positive and there is a model and we can learn it right now online. And I said, well, is it an obstacle that the course is in English? And she said, no, that's our common language. We can all take this course right now. And I was like, oh my God, the body positive is coming to Poland.
Wow.
How fun is that?
That's so cool. I love that. I love that there's like a consortium of people doing this work too in Europe. That's so exciting.
I know. How fun is that? And that they can just take the model, adapt it for the population they're serving and run.
Right. Well, so that leads me into just, wanting to know more about where people can find you and be able to take the model, because we have a lot of health professionals listening and probably also a lot of people who could, be peer facilitators for this too in various academic settings.
Absolutely. Master's level dietitians and other mental health providers can get CEs for taking these courses. So thebodypositive.org is our website, and it opens to the Institute page, which is our online coursework. And the Body Positive Fundamentals teaches the 5 competencies of our model, each of which promotes resilience against eating and body image problems, or what we call disruptions to healthy embodiment. And if you're a clinician, there's also a clinical additional training that you can take. So you take all 5 competencies and then this additional course, and that's the clinical orientation package. And that gives, like 25 CEs, because it involves also reading the book. It's a huge thing. And it's really fun because all of the videos we're telling stories. We're sharing other leaders who've been trained, how they experience each competency. So it's colorful and fun, and it's really beautiful. The whole website and all of the courses are gorgeous. And it's fun because you do your own work all the way throughout with your own worksheets and your own reading and writing. And so it's lively and fun. You get a lot of credit if you need CEs. And if you don't, you can just enter. There's a button, I want to help myself. And there's a button, I want to help others. If you go to, I want to help myself, you just take the fundamentals course for yourself and work on healing your own relationship. And these really powerful, effective tools that have come from just listening to people for 20 years and asking, what do you need in order to have a healthy, resilient relationship with your body? And then taking their ideas and creating a model, and then giving the model to people, not in a prescribed way. It's just a series of questions for you to find out what's right for you, or to adapt to the population you're serving and help them find out what they need. So that's one way. Another way people can get trained is they can come to a live body positive facilitator training. And there's 2 coming up in the next year. One is in Boston in November, and the other is in San Diego in February 2019. And those are really fun to be part of. They're big trainings with 50 to 100 people, and a real mix of, high school activists, people in their 50s and 60s and 70s, professionals, a lot of registered dietitians, anybody who's committed to transforming the body relationship. In day 1, we teach our model experientially, so it's very intimate and vulnerable. And in day 2, we hand the curriculum to them and teach them how to teach it. And then we certify them to go out in the world and transform the world. And those workshops are really fun. We might not be doing those forever because we're working on putting the facilitators up online and the training, and we haven't gotten there yet. So if you want to teach our curriculum, you have to take a live training. But to learn the curriculum for yourself and learn the model, you can do that right now online.
I love that. That's so great. Every time I talked to Connie for the podcast a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And so people should go listen to that episode too, because it's a really good one. But I remember when she was on, I was like, I want to do that. And now I'm like, I want to do that. Never any time. But one day I will come to a live training because that sounds like so much fun.
Yeah, those are really fun. We also have a book called Embody, which Connie wrote, and it describes our model chapter by chapter in stories. And so it's a really fun way to learn. Even young people can really get a lot out of reading that book. And at the end of each chapter, there's exercises and activities you can use or teach or whatever you want.
Yeah, I love that book. And I actually, a couple of the exercises from it, I adapted and used in my intuitive eating online course. So it's been very useful. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And that's available on the Body Positive website as well.
Awesome. And where is that? What is the URL for that?
Thebodypositive.org.
Awesome.
So you have to put the in the front. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Not bodypositive.org.
Thebodypositive.org.
Wonderful. Yeah. We'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can find it and connect with you online and learn more about your work.
Great.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's really wonderful talking with you.
Well, it's really wonderful to connect with you, Christy, a sister in arms. It sounds like you're doing the same work out in the world, and I really am grateful. I'm really grateful that your whole generation is taking this up.
Thank you. So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Elizabeth Scott for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical guidance to get started on your own anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Head over to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message, because who doesn't in this diet culture world, by sharing with your friends and family, and of course, making sure you're subscribed yourself. Just go to christyharrison.com/subscribe to see tons of different options for where to do that. Also, just a quick heads up that we're going to be reposting one of our fan favorite episodes next week for the 4th of July holiday. It's a really great episode. I think one of people's favorites of all time. I still get emails and Twitter posts about it and stuff like a couple years later. And those of you who haven't been listening for that long, you can discover a new episode that maybe you haven't gotten to in the archives yet. Those of you who have heard it, it's full of so much juicy wisdom and goodness that it's definitely worth a repeat listen. So check that out next week. And then I'll be back again the following week in 2 weeks with a brand new episode with someone else that I'm super excited to talk to and been wanting to talk to for a long time, and we finally made it happen. So that is definitely something to look forward to. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/160. That's christyharrison.com/160. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. And remember, there are still a few days left to join my Master Your Anti-Diet Message workshop if you're listening to this episode the day it drops. The seminar's for fellow health and wellness pros who know that diet culture has controlled the conversation in our field for way too long and that it's high time for a change. If you're ready to stop taking part in diet culture's version of health, start advocating for non-diet approaches that truly help your clients' well-being, and build a thriving brand that magnetizes an audience who's really ready for change from the diet culture status quo, head over to christyharrison.com/message to learn more and sign up. That's christyharrison.com/message. A big thanks to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, and to my Food Psych programs team, including our community manager and content development associate, Ashley Saruya, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, and our transcript assistant, Megan Saichi, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and is designed by Meredith Noble. And the music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect position?